Man, happy Father's Day to you guys out there. A couple things we got going on, okay? Just want to make you aware of. One, we've got bacon and eggs in a waffle cone. And so for all the fellas out there, that's for you. I'm sure that they'd give it to a lady too. So if you want one out there, no one's going to stop you. And so, okay, so my notes are out. That's never happened before. Okay, we'll see how I got it. So wow. So we got the bacon and waffle cone for you. We've got a pull-up bar out there for you as well. So I think that the record right now is 25. And so that's a big number, okay? It's a big number, but there are a few of you guys, and you hear that, and your thought is, I can do it. Here's the thing, maybe you're like, maybe I can do it. Be the change you want to see in the world. This is your moment. Go out there and do it. And if you win, man, be as arrogant as a person can be, because that's really the only appropriate response. So that, and we got all that stuff happening, and so it's going to be really good. But it is our way of just saying Happy Father's Day. And what we do on Father's Day is we like to just acknowledge the sacrifices that the men in our lives make, And as I think about it, I get the privilege. My dad goes to church here. And I live close to my dad, and so as I get the privilege of getting to be around my dad, I get to see this firsthand in my own life. And I was thinking about it, just even this, as we're talking about this idea of sacrifice. And, my dad is such a great example of this. Last Thursday, just for example, not this Thursday, but last Thursday, my dad spent the morning ripping out my sister's deck. Okay, not because he didn't have a whim and just go do it. No, she asked him to. And so he goes, rips out my sister's deck, and then as soon as he finishes that, he comes to my house before I get off work, and he starts power washing my fence. And he's doing that. I get home from work, and when I get home from work, I'm like, well, now that the fence is power washed, I need to stain it. And so my dad's like, well, you gonna do that today? And I was like, well, yeah. And so he ends up he's like, well, I guess I'll help you. And so then my dad stays at my house till after 6 o'clock, just staining my fence, which the older you get, the more that those, you realize they're muscles that hurt when you do stuff like that. And so whatever, he stayed and did all that for us. And then it was Friday, and that Friday he came and cleaned the church. He's the maintenance guy here, and so he cleaned. And then it was Saturday, we were getting ready for block party. And I had the beautiful job of moving rocks. So that's what I'm good at. It's all creative people and then the people who move rocks. I was a rock mover. And so me and a couple guys were moving rocks in a wheelbarrow. And as we're moving rocks in this wheelbarrow, it breaks, which is horrible when you've got all these rocks that need to be moved. And I don't want to just carry them with a shovel where they need to go. That's why you have a wheelbarrow. And so what do? I call my dad. He just lives in Ozark. So I was like, hey, Dad, wheelbarrow broke. Do you have one we can use? And so he comes with a bunch of shovels, wheelbarrow, and while we're loading the rocks in the wheelbarrow, he fixed the one that was broken at the church. And so then he stays until all the rocks are moved, because he's just that. He's that kind of guy. And so I told him, I'm like, Dad, you don't have to stay. We've got this project that we're doing, and so you'll be all right. And he's like, no, I got it. I'm not going to leave. And so he stays it. And then I was talking to him, and this is very my dad. Okay, it's very my dad. He's up there, it's Monday, he's in the office cleaning some stuff. And I'm like, Dad, seriously, man, you do so much. You didn't have to stay. You didn't have to move this stuff. And my dad said, this is very my dad. He said, Ryan, I don't like to leave my stuff places. So maybe he wasn't as altruistic as we thought. But, it was still a sacrifice. There's other things he could have been doing, but instead he did that. And then my dad's a great guy, and he loves Jesus, and so he knows that the sacrifice that he makes for us, it really pales in comparison with the one that we're going to look at this morning. And the sacrifice that we're going to look at this morning is the greatest sacrifice that's ever been made for a person. So Jesus Christ came and he died on a cross for us. But nothing even comes close to that. And it's just so interesting because the way we think about the cross is so different. It's because Jesus has transformed it, but it's so different than how they would have thought about it in the first century. Like if someone from 30 AD were to just like appear here right now and they were to see you with a cross necklace, and then they were to go to your house and see that you have crosses hanging up on your walls, they would think you are a psychopath. Because it would be the equivalent of us decorating and wearing electric chair jewelry. Like it was a very, very difficult, heinous, disgusting way to die. And that's what Jesus endured, that it was something that was so disgusting, so traumatic, that the historian Tom Holland, not Spider-Man, the historian Tom Holland, that he says that there are only 4 eyewitness accounts or testimonies of the cross. And part of the reason why is because it was so gruesome that no one wanted to admit that they were there. And the 4 eyewitness accounts of the cross are Matthew, Luke, John, and the one that we're going to look at this morning, the Gospel of Mark. And so where we pick up in Mark's Gospel, we've been walking through it verse by verse for a little bit now. And 2 weeks ago, we looked at Jesus. He stood trial before the Sanhedrin, the religious leaders of the day. And now, the last week we looked at him, he stood trial before Pilate. And now he is literally on the road to the cross, the road to our redemption. And you see it pick up here in Mark chapter 15, verse 20, and it says this, and they led him out to crucify him. And they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. And they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Now, a few things here worth noting. One is that the road from where they were to Golgotha, that it was a very public place. So as Jesus is carrying as they're leading these criminals to be executed, that they would have been doing it in a place where people would have been doing business. So this would be the equivalent of someone who is going to the electric chair walking through Farmers Park on Saturday morning. That they're going in front of this really just to add humiliation. And part of the reason is the cross wasn't only an instrument of punishing someone, but the cross was also Rome's way of saying, don't you dare mess with us. Because to make such a spectacle of these people who are going to Golgotha, what it's saying to everyone who's watching, because it was very public, is what it is saying, we will follow through. It's saying, you might think that this is so heinous that we would never do it. No, we absolutely will. So if you're thinking of an insurrection, know that if we catch you, this is your fate. Not only is it saying that, but it's saying, do not mess with Rome. You don't want to pay your taxes, you probably just pay your taxes. Because we do punish our criminals in Rome. And one of the ways they would do it, just to add insult to injury, is they would make you, those who were crucified, they would make you carry your crossbeam to the place where you were to be executed. And what we know, because we looked at this last week, is that part of Jesus' punishment after he was found guilty with Pilate, he was scourged. And the scourging would have made Jesus so weak that the reason why he's not carrying his crossbeam is because physically he cannot. The soldiers aren't going to do it. So they find this man named Simon, the Cyrene, and they force him to carry Jesus' cross, and Jesus follows behind him on the way up. What's interesting is that his sons are named. That if you look at the other 3 Gospels, that Mark is the only one who names Rufus and Alexander. And the reason why he does that, at least a lot of people think, is because Mark was the gospel that was written to Rome. And most people think that Rufus and Alexander would have been living in Rome when Mark was in circulation. And so this is kind of Mark's way of saying, if you don't believe the story, you can ask them. And the reason why we think that is because if you look at Romans chapter 16, Paul, at the end of his letter to the church at Rome, he lists off names of all these people who would have been members or involved in the church. And one of the names he mentions is Rufus, so a lot of people think it's talking about that Rufus, which is kind of interesting on Father's Day to think of that. This Simon, the Cyrene, him carrying the cross impacted his kids so much that here they are decades later in Rome worshiping Jesus because they probably were introduced to him because of what their father did. Their father carried the cross for Jesus to maybe make less of a spectacle for him. And so they go to Golgotha, and then when they get to Golgotha, this is what happens next. It says, and they offered him, Jesus, wine mixed with myrrh, but he didn't take it. And they crucified him, dividing his garments among them, casting lots for them to decide what each should take. And it was the third hour when they crucified him. What Mark is showing us is he's showing us that as Jesus is being crucified, he's being treated like a common criminal. That there's no special treatment that Jesus gets because of who he is, but instead what they're doing is they are just treating Jesus like they would anyone else. It says there that they offered him wine mixed with myrrh. And the reason why they would have done that is that it had a narcotic effect. So it's kind of like a way that he wouldn't have had, if he would have taken it, most people believe that he wouldn't have felt all the pain of the cross, but he would have been kind of like unconscious for that part, and he doesn't take it. And the reason why he doesn't take it, at least a lot of people have speculated, is because he wanted to be fully conscious of what he was going through. That on his road to the cross, he was not interested in taking any shortcuts, but instead what he's doing is he's going to feel the cross and all of its weight. And the reason why he does this for us, he feels all of it so that we don't have to feel any of it. And so they offer him this drink, and he turns it away. He says, no, I'm going to endure. Not only that, but if you notice there, it says that they divided his garments among him, which is very customary for criminals. So at that point, when a criminal was executed, what would happen is those who were there, they would, like the soldiers, would be able to divide their possessions amongst themselves, and that was kind of what they got to take as part of their payment for what they were doing. And it's worth noting that Jesus Christ, at the end of his life, all he possesses are the clothes on his back. That Jesus, God's Son, when he dies, he only owns what he wears. He was poor. That no one in this room would be that poor. He walked out of heaven where he has everything, and at the very end of his life, all he has are the clothes on his back. And we talked about this last week, but he became poor so that you could become rich. That this is what he experienced, and he did it for you. And now as he's there, and he's on the cross, and he's being crucified, then you see what comes next, and it's kind of just like, it's a little mockery, it's a little just kind of how things were, and you see this in verse 26. It says, in the inscription of the charge against him, so there would be this placard over his head, and the inscription on that placard over his head said, the King of the Jews. And with him they crucified two robbers, one on his right and one on his left. Now that placard is interesting. So what it's doing a couple things. One of the things it's doing is it's showing what he's guilty of. That when he stood trial before Pilate, he was convicted of saying he was the King of the Jews, which would have been, like he's saying he's the king of a group of people in Roman-occupied territory, and so him saying that he is king would have been an offense, an affront to the empire, or the emperor, really. And so they're saying this is why he's up there. He's up here because he said that he was the king in a place where there is one king, and it is the emperor. So that's part of it. But it was also written in a way, because Pilate, he hated the Jewish leaders, and so it was kind of a way to stick it to them. Because it doesn't say that he was convicted, it just says the King of the Jews, which they would have been so frustrated to see above his head. And the reason why they would have been so frustrated, because what it's saying is it's saying that he died as the Messiah. That he died as their king. That they understood what he was saying, and so as he's up there, he's experiencing it. But then you also have this happening while he's up there. That there's two criminals with him. I don't know if you've ever heard the phrase, like, I don't know, birds of a feather flock together. For some of the older generation, probably you've heard that expression. Maybe you've heard the expression, if you grew up in youth group about the same time as me, like, show me your friends, I'll show you your future. This, with the two criminals and Jesus in the middle, this is clearly a one of these things is not like the other. That these two robbers who have been crucified with him, that word robber, it's actually probably better translated zealot. And the reason why I say that is because this guy, this Jewish historian named Josephus, that in his writings, when he uses that word, it's always translated zealot. And if you look at the NLT, they translate it insurrectionist. And the idea here is that Jesus is up on the cross in the middle of these two guys who are all guilty of trying to really overthrow Roman power. And Jesus is in the middle saying, this is the most famous one. And again, just screaming, do not mess with Rome. But the problem is the guy in the middle, the guy who's the highest up, he's innocent. He never wanted to overthrow Rome, but he's next to these two people, which just would have added insult to injury. And something Mark wants us to see, especially as we looked at this the last several weeks, is he wants us to see that Jesus at the end of his life, that he was completely by himself. Completely by himself. And you see this as the rest of this text kind of finishes. What you see is you see three groups of people who mock him as he's on the cross. Look at this. It says this. And those who passed by derided him, saying, "Aha! You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." They're making a logical argument here. They're saying, if you really are so strong that you are going to destroy the temple, then you would surely never be overpowered like you have just been overpowered. They're saying, if you really are who you said you are, you wouldn't be up there. And if you think about what they're saying, it's wrong. Like, they're not even quoting Jesus correctly. That when he talks about destroying the temple and rebuilding it in 3 days, he's not talking about the actual temple. He's talking about the temple of his body. So they're misquoting him. And even when he talks about destroying the actual temple, we looked at this in Mark chapter 13 a few months ago, he never gives a time frame. He just says it's going to be destroyed. So what they're mocking him with is something they don't even understand. They are misquoting him while he's up there. And just think about that, okay? Think of how much you like to defend yourself. That when someone misquotes you, when someone gets something wrong about you, what do you want to do? Is you want to make sure that people realize that they are wrong about you. And here Jesus is listening to those who pass by him as he's hanging up there. Does he say anything? Does he correct them? Does he tell them what temple he's talking? No, he just sits up there and takes it. Because he's already resolved his fate. And so there's a spectacle of people who are mocking him while he's up there. And they're just passing by, going on their business, mocking him, making him look a fool. And then there's another group that mocks him. And it says, so also the chief priests and the scribes mocked him one to another, saying, he saved others. He cannot save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe. Where it says there that he saved others, it's talking about his exorcisms and his healings. And basically what they're saying is if those things were legit, he would have been able to do them for himself too. I mean, who do we look out for the most? We look out for ourselves. And if he's not going to look out for himself, then clearly there must have been something happening there that he must not have understood, that we must not have seen. But what I think is so interesting, though, is if you look at what he's saying, there's this kind of this like aura of spirituality that they say there at the end. And it's completely untrue, but they're trying to be spiritual. They're saying, but if he did come down, then I'd believe. That if he really did, if he came down from the cross, then I would believe him. And if you think about that statement, we do the same type of thing. We don't phrase it that way because we're not looking at him on the cross, but what we'll say, you know what? If God did this, then I'd believe in him. I would believe in God if he did this thing for me. Then I would believe. Or maybe what we'll do is we'll do the opposite of that. And the opposite of that kind of says, since God didn't do this, then I won't believe. Like, that's just another version of saying that. It's kind of what's happening. And there's a lot of problems with that. One, that's really not how you should ever approach God, because if he is God, then who are we to dictate anything from him? But I would just say that if what we've been talking about for the last, several weeks, with everything that Jesus has endured on the cross, if that is true, and that really happened, and Jesus Christ, if he endured all that scorn, all that shame, all that ridicule, then who are we to demand anything from him? Because the reality of what we have seen is that there was not a part of him that he held back to give to you. So to come to him and to demand anything, it's very difficult. So not only is that, I would say that, I would also say what these guys are doing here in saying this thing that sounds spiritual, come down from the cross so we may see and believe. They are overvaluing miracles. They're overvaluing miracles. We know that they don't believe in Jesus. They've already made up their mind. And so one of the groups that's mentioned here is the scribes. Okay, the scribes. And the scribes have seen Jesus do all kinds of stuff. And if you go all the way back to Mark chapter 3, okay, there was this really significant exorcism, and probably all exorcisms are significant, okay? But there was one really significant where Jesus does this exorcism, casts a demon out, and the scribes came from Jerusalem to watch Jesus do it. They're trying to figure out who this Jesus guy is. And after watching Jesus do a bona fide miracle, look at what it says. Look at how they responded in Mark chapter 3, verse 22. It says, they responded to Jesus, casting out a demon, not by putting their faith in him, not by trusting him, but no, what did they do? They said, he's possessed by Beelzebub. By the prince of demons, he casts out demons. So if he literally got off the cross, snapped the nails down, you know what they would say? They'd say, it's by demons that he did that too. Because they'd already made up their mind about him. And if you're that person here where you're like, you know what, if God did this, then I would believe. If that's where you are, I bet if you were to zoom out of your life, I bet you could find numerous examples of God coming through for you and you giving credit to something else. You're like, I prayed for the job. And I got the job, but the more I thought about it, the reason why I got it is because my resume was on point. The reason why I got it is because I had this experience and it worked out. Kid's sick. Yeah, I prayed. I really prayed. I prayed that my kid would be healed. I prayed for them really hard. You know what? And they were healed. But the more I think about it, the more I think it's probably just because we had a really good doctor. There was this thing I really wanted, and so I prayed that I would get that thing that I really wanted, and it didn't seem like it was going to happen, and then I got it. The more I think about it, the more I think it's probably just because I worked really hard for that. When you do that, you've already made up your mind. You've already decided. You're just trying to sound you're giving a spiritual reason for not putting your faith in Jesus. That's what they're doing. They're watching him die, and they're saying, if he came down, I'd probably believe in him, when the truth is their mind was already made up, and oftentimes ours is too. So you see that happen, and there's one final group up there on the cross with him, and who are really opposing him, for Mark to really paint this picture that as Jesus is up here, he's up here all by himself. And it's those who are crucified with him. Look at this in verse 32. It says, those who were crucified with him also reviled him. And so Mark is showing us that these criminals, that they too thought they were better than him. Now, some of you hear that, and maybe you grew up in youth group at the same time as me, and so you heard that song by Third Day about the thief, or you're familiar with Luke's account where it does say that one of the thieves ended up putting their faith in Jesus, and so you're like, how does that work with Mark saying they reviled him? And you got to remember, we're dealing with eyewitness accounts. And so when you have 4 people tell you about the same event, what will happen is you're going to get 4 different perspectives on the same event. But if we were all to go see a Springfield Cardinals game today and we were to come back and report on it, we all would emphasize different details of the game. Doesn't mean that the game didn't happen, it just means that, well, this is my perspective and this is your perspective and that's it. And so what Mark is doing here, he's giving his perspective. And part of his perspective is that Jesus, as he was crucified, he was all by himself. And if you were to look at him, and compare it to Luke's gospel, you're like, but that Mark's probably telling the first part of them being on the cross together. They're reviling him at the beginning. And what Luke is showing us is Luke is showing us the end. That at the end of it, as Jesus is dying, this man realizes in the way that Jesus dies that he needs him. And if you think about even in Mark's gospel, one of the things that we'll see next week is that Jesus died in a way that drew people to him. But at the very end of the gospel, it says the centurion watching Jesus die. He watches Jesus die, and his response to Jesus' death is, surely this was the Son of God. It's possible that's probably what happened with the thieves or the robbers, the revolutionaries. That as they're watching Jesus die, as they're watching him be insulted and never respond, as they're watching him endure all this pain, as they're aware of the fact that he was so broken, that as they're seeing him die, this one of them's like, man, this is not right. And that's what happens. Now you come to this text, okay, and there's a lot of times when it comes to preaching where you're like, okay, there are 2 types of messages. There are those where it's, this is what we do, and then there are messages where it's like, this is what we know. And when you think about the gospel, one of the things Tim Keller says when he talks about the gospel, he says the gospel's news. That it's news. It's an event in history that happened for you. And for us, as we think about this text, I don't think the best way to respond is 3 things for us to consider. As much as I think what this is for us as we think about the crosses, that's where we are in Mark's gospel, is really the question I think that we need to consider is, why is the cross important? Or maybe even more, maybe worded a different way, is what did he do on the cross? And as you think about what did he do on the cross, well, what Jesus did on the cross was he became cursed for you. We all deserve to be cursed. But Jesus became cursed so that you don't have to be. And the reason why we know that is if you go all the way back to Deuteronomy, it says this in Deuteronomy chapter, I think it's 21, 21. It says, and if a man has committed a crime punishable by death, and he's put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night on the tree, but you shall bury him the same day. For a hanged man is cursed by God. Jesus is well aware that as he's up there, that he is being cursed. And when you think about that, everything he experienced, he walked right into. He walked right into a curse for you. And when you think about just the idea of being cursed, something that we all really, really try hard to avoid. There's an example from the TV show The Office, season 4, episode 1. There's 3 things happen in the office that are bad. Like in the show, it's like there's 3 things that happen over the course of the episode, and Michael Scott, the boss, he's like, do we know that this building wasn't built on an ancient Indian burial ground? And it's stupid, but the point is, though, that like you wouldn't want to build something on an ancient Indian burial ground. Or if you found out that someone died in your house, you'd probably try to sell it and not tell anyone who buys your house that someone died in your house, right? Why? Well, because you don't want to be cursed. That's not how it works. Like, it doesn't have that kind of power, but what we do everything we can to avoid those types of things. That's my point. We would avoid those things with everything within us. And Jesus goes right into it. He walks right into a curse for you. And the thing I think is so amazing is you think about those religious leaders, and they're like celebrating the fact that Jesus was crucified, high-fiving each other, saying like, yeah, we got it. What they don't realize is that what they thought was their greatest victory was actually their greatest defeat. My daughter Madeline and I, we were studying this text together this week, and she said this. She's like, it's so interesting, Dad, because if Jesus would have got off the cross like they were saying he would do, then none of us would be saved. And that's the truth, is that if he would have gotten off the cross, we wouldn't be. But because he got off the cross, or because he stayed on the cross, we get to be saved. Because he was willing to be cursed, we're able to not be cursed. And I like the way that Paul says it. He kind of brings it full circle in Galatians chapter 3 and brings a lot of context to what Jesus was doing as he was cursed for us. And it says this in Galatians chapter 3. It says, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us, for it is written, cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree. We deserved that. We deserve to be the one hanged up there. We deserve to be the one who paid. But Jesus on the cross, he pays for us. That it would be very similar to you standing trial, discovering that you're guilty for something that you did, that you absolutely deserve to be guilty of, and the judge lets someone else pay your sentence instead of you. That on the cross, what Jesus is doing is he is paying the sentence that you deserve. And what you get is you get to go free. And I love the way that John says it, that John says it this way, talking about the cross, okay? And it's like prophetic in that it's so early in John's gospel, but it says this in John chapter 3. It says, just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so the Son of Man may be so the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life, that he is lifted up in this way so that you can look to him. And that in looking to him, what you get is you get credit for the price that he paid. But you've got to look to him is the thing. Like the gift is yours, that it's available, but some people, what they say is, no, I'd rather just continue to pay. Jesus died so that you don't have to. And so how do you respond to a text like this? I think we need to do what we did last week, which is I think we need to think about it. And I think one of the great ways to think about a text like this is to sing a song that communicates what we've been thinking about. That what did Jesus do here? What is happening on the cross? What's happening on the cross is that Jesus paid it all. He paid for you something you could never pay for yourself. And that to truly see that, to truly realize that, is to realize that you have a debt that you would never be able to pay. And so what I want us to do is I want us to just kind of, if you'd stand with me, I want us to sing this song and really just think about the fact that on the cross, Jesus, he paid it all.
Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin has left left a crimson stain. He washed it white as snow. And Jesus paid it all. All to him I owe. Sin has left a crimson stain. He washed it white as snow. Sing, Jesus paid it all. All to him I owe. Sin has left a crimson stain. He washed it white as snow. Oh, Jesus paid it all. To him I owe. Sin has left a crimson stain. He washed it white as snow. And oh, praise the one who paid my debt and raised his life up from the dead. Oh, praise the one who paid my debt and raised his life up from the dead. Oh, praise the one who paid my debt and raised his life up from the dead. Oh, praise the one who paid my debt and raised his life up from the dead. Jesus paid all. All to him I owe. Sin has left a crimson stain. He washed it white as snow.
Jesus, you paid it all. And we just humbly acknowledge that you paid our debt. You became first for us. That you died for our sins. Because of that, we're white as snow. God, you don't see us as our sins deserve, but instead you look at us and you see your Son. God, thank you. Thank you for paying our debt, for giving us what better than what we deserve. And Jesus, we love you. We thank you, and we put our trust in you. It's in your name. Amen. Amen. Love you guys.
Thanks so much for checking us out online. I just hope that whatever you saw, that it was a blessing and an encouragement to your life.
And if you'd like to give today, there are 2 ways you can do so. You can text your amount to 84321, or you can go to giving.nlspringfield.com and give that way. And if you'd like to join us in person, we'd love to have you. Our service times are at 8, 9:30, and 11.
And if you're new, the first Sunday of every single month, we have an event called Party with the Pastors, which is a great way for you to get to know us, and it's a great way for us to get to know you. So we look forward to seeing you there.